Good evening to those who've arrived a bit early. We'll be starting at 6 o'clock. Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting promptly at 6. We'll just give it another minute or so for people to get logged into the call, and then we shall begin. And good evening, and welcome to this evening's NEU SEND and Alternative Revision Zoom. My name is Daniel Coverdie. I'm your national president for this year, and I'm a teacher actually in an alternative provision and primary trained, but spent most of my teaching career educating children with social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. So it's a real privilege to chair this evening. Today, actually, I've been on a picket line, and I just want to say a little bit of something about that before we start. I was on a picket line at St Francis College in Hertfordshire. It's an independent school, and they are under threat of fire and rehire. The employer intends to terminate their contract, take them out of the teachers' pension scheme, and put them into a new pension scheme, obviously on lesser conditions. The reason I want to just highlight it to you all is it's very much the thin end of the wedge, isn't it? If they can go for their pensions in the independent schools, it'll be the academies next, and then it'll be local authority schools. So please, everybody, stand in solidarity with our independent sector colleagues as they aren't just fighting for their own pensions, but they're fighting for all of ours too. As you will well be aware, that the NEU has launched a new orientation called Value Educators, Value Education, and this half term we're asking members to raise the issue of workload in their schools, and there are plenty of tools for you to do that in the VEVE hub. So please take a look at that and raise the issue of workload in your schools. Next half term we're going to be focusing on Ofsted. As we saw yesterday, they've got a £24 million boost to up the inspection regime and ensure that every school is inspected in the next 4 years. In fact, there have been calls to Zinawi by MPs to make Ofsted inspections a priority for SEND schools. And we think actually that money can be better spent by not giving it to bureaucrats with clipboards, but actually spend it on children. There is a funding crisis that's ongoing in education, and SEND is in major need of some real funding. Tonight we've got a number of speakers who all have experience and or work in SEND settings, so I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jenny Cooper, who will be talking about COVID and risk assessments and where we are now. So welcome, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and ditto to everything you've just said. Okay, just roughly 4 issues I want to raise tonight that I think are all current in special schools and probably in alternative provisions as well. The first one I want to raise is about vaccine access. So we know that some of our members in special schools, despite being at higher risk at the beginning of the pandemic, struggled to sometimes get early access to vaccines alongside our colleagues in adult health and social care. But after a struggle, we did manage to get earlier access to the vaccines than people in most mainstream schools, which isn't necessarily good for them, but was good for us. It's got to that time where we're being told that immunity is dropping off after the first 2 jabs and that people need to go and get their booster jabs. And we know this is true ourselves because we have staff members who've been double jabbed, still going off with COVID and still getting quite seriously ill with COVID, and in some cases hospitalized. So what I want to raise is the issue that I see a kind of postcode lottery going on. Sometimes it's about people, even though they did manage to get the first jabs early, are not being able to easily access the booster one, or they can get the booster one, but only if they're over 50 and not if they're under 50. But also there's an issue with the fact that the supplies seem to be a bit patchy. So in the own area where I live, there's been situations where you kind of book and then you go down to whatever chemist it is and you go down there and they say, oh, we've run out, come back tomorrow, kind of thing. Or they've got the ones in place for, you know, certain age groups and not others, or whatever. So we do need to demand access to these, but what we also need to demand is time off if needed in order to access them early. So what you're needing to do this time round is book your own slot. But the problem is a lot of the slots available are in the time when we would be teaching. But because we know it's of risk to us, but also risks disruption to education by not getting the booster, that is the argument to use with your employer to say, look, this is the time I can get is, you know, next Wednesday at 11 or whatever, I need to be released to go at that time to get it. So the other thing alongside that is that we need to continue to demand access to vaccines for our children who have underlying health conditions and children with learning disabilities, whatever age they are, because we know they're more at risk of serious cases of COVID. And in a lot of cases, that's not happening. They're still only accessing it if they're over a certain age. We've had vaccine centres running in some of our special schools, but again, there's been issues with supplies, there's been issues with access for families to actually get there. Not being given enough choice of days, etc., etc. And I do know as well for a fact, because this happened in my own school, that in some cases we've run a vaccine centre and there's been some left over at the end of the day. So I hope that in every school where that's happening, the spare ones are being offered to staff, because that's what happened in my school. The second thing I want to raise is the ongoing COVID risk and about ventilation in our schools, and the fact that what we now know, which we didn't know so well even a year ago, is that this is an airborne illness, and the biggest risk to COVID is in breathing in the particles of COVID that are in the air all the time. The biggest risk is not to do with not washing your hands or surfaces being cleaned or sharing musical instruments or whatever. The biggest risk is from just breathing in the air, which is shared with other people who are breathing out COVID. And what we know from our ventilation training that's being run by the NEU in partnership with hazards is that the smaller the particles, the higher risk you are. So you're not at highest risk by being close to a child and then them sneezing on you, because those are big droplets which go into your mouth and your throat and give you cold-like symptoms. But if you breathe in the smaller particles that are building up in the air all the time in your classroom, those get taken right down into your lungs and are likely to cause more serious illness. So the emphasis needs to move away from cleaning and wash your hands. I mean, still do all that, obviously, but the emphasis needs to be about the air that we breathe being safe. And of course, the particular issue in special schools where we have children with underlying health conditions is that as soon as you open all the windows, it's too cold for them. Anybody that's disabled and can't move about as much as other people is going to get cold quicker. We also know that the nature of the teaching that we do in our special schools is that we do more singing. There's quite often lots of shrieking going on, not in a negative way necessarily, but shrieking with excitement, because that might be how our children choose to express themselves. But all those things bring higher risk to the levels of CO2 that are in the air. The advice that's been given in our own ventilation training is that if you are not able to socially distance from the children that you're teaching with, which in most cases in special schools will be the case, you should be asking for medical grade masks to be provided still. So not just any old fabric or paper face covering, but an FFP2 or if possible FFP3 medical grade face covering. Also, just to highlight the ventilation guidance that's on the NEU website that people should use, which explains to you if your CO2 levels go above 800 parts per million, what you need to do next to escalate that issue collectively in your school. We know that CO2 monitors have arrived in most special schools by now from the DFE, so it's therefore surprising that we're not seeing lots of action happening collectively across the country and people mobilising around the fact that the CO2 levels are too high in the classrooms, because I've seen it and I know how quickly those levels can rise up, particularly if there's singing and shouting and shrieking and all the rest of it. So that's that one. The third thing that I want to raise, because I can't go through a single meeting without raising it, is my hobby horse subject of risk assessments. So everything needs risk assessing, of course, but what I want to remind people of is that the DfE are still telling us that you still have to have a COVID risk assessment for your school. Now, the COVID risk assessment still has to involve union reps and union members being consulted. Otherwise, the risk assessment is not worth the paper it's written on. So if something is happening that you think is unsafe in your school, your first thing is to say, what's in the risk assessment? And if the right thing isn't in the risk assessment, it's because you haven't been consulted properly. So that's the way to start with that. Now, higher risk means more mitigations are needed. Higher risk. Why are we at higher risk in special schools and alternative provisions? Well, our children tend to travel together on buses or local authority transport to get to their provision. That's a higher risk in the first place. We've got kids who are being tube fed, kids who are being suctioned. We have people involved in personal care with the students. We have physical behaviour interventions going on, which mean touching each other, basically, and close assistance being provided through all of our teaching activities, and children with lots of underlying health conditions. That's the higher risk bit. So what do we need to do? We need more control measures. We need the PPE that I've just mentioned, medical grade masks. We need proper ventilation. And where proper ventilation is not possible, we need air filtration. That means funding. All right, so we should be lobbying our school and our councils to provide additional funding to provide air filters where the ventilation is not right, as well as all the other things like opening doors and windows if possible, and having some outdoor learning if possible, because that's always good for the children anyway. Most of all, no big gatherings. I've lost count of how many people in special schools have contacted me about we're having an in-person assembly / parents evening / concert / pantomime, whatever, with every single person piling into the school hall. Yes, it's really sad that our children can't currently have those massive gatherings because it's unsafe and they're the things that everybody loves. However, it's much sadder if the people that are caring for them die as a result of those things taking place, because this is still a life and death matter that we're talking about. And you only need to look at the measures that are in place to protect people in other countries in Europe to know what a kind of lax approach is being taken here by our government in this country. And then the fourth thing I want to say is just a little bit about education in general in our schools and the recovery that we're supposed to be undergoing after lockdown. We know that we need time for that recovery because our children who have learning disabilities and autism and, you know, sometimes challenging behaviours and things like that, they feel insecure when things change, and things changed massively beyond recognition at the start of the pandemic and through the lockdowns. So as a result, we've got some unusual behaviours going on in our schools. We see an increase in mental health issues amongst children and staff, I have to say. And also, we mustn't forget those children who continued to shield for months and months because of the underlying conditions that they had, and how strange and horrible it must be for them coming back when everybody else came back so much earlier and they were kind of left out of things. And yet we're being told by our managers the Ofsted mantra of produce me a document with the 3 I's on it: intent, implementation, impact, as if that is the most important thing, as if our curriculum at the moment shouldn't be focused on nurturing and helping people to recover. And added to that, we've got the issue of the teacher pay freeze and worse still, the low level of pay for the TAs that work in our schools. And our schools could not run without our support staff. They absolutely could not run without our support staff. When we talk about valuing educators, valuing education and valuing educators, it comes down to the staff and our support staff, and they need to be valued in order for our schools to recover. And just as a parting shot to link this to climate change and COP26, a low carbon economy means putting people first, not putting profit first. And if we got that right, everything else would get right as well. Okay, so keep your schools safe and try and remember those messages, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Keep your schools safe, make sure there's a risk assessment, and fight climate change. I think those are very good key messages to take away from this call. We'll move over to our next speaker. Our next speaker also teaches in PRU and has a wealth of experience of teaching in alternative provision. So welcome Lee Seedhouse from Oxford.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and good evening, everybody. So as Daniel says, my name's Lee Seedhouse. I do work in alternative provision, pupil referral units, and I also work within teaching students that have got SEN in terms of numeracy. This evening, my main focus is going to be focusing on alternative provision, and I want to kind of focus on the crisis that we've got going on in this sector at the moment, which seems not to necessarily be made, people aren't aware of it. So I'm going to focus on what the funding issue is and why the funding issue has become about. I also want to talk to people about tender, something that people might not have come across before, and the dangers of what can happen when things do go to tender. So I'm going to put some slides on the screen, just more as a bit of a bullet point for myself, so I know where I'm at when I'm talking to you. And then hopefully this will be some information that can move forward. I've put my email address on the bottom so that if anybody does have any questions or anything that doesn't get answered later, then feel free to get in touch with me. So the first part that I'm going to be focusing on is the funding crisis. So as we're all probably aware, there's been a lack of referrals for students to attend alternative provision over the last 18 months. Because of that, there's been a significant reduction in funding. So because of the lack of funding, that therefore means that overall, there's been a significant reduction in the amount of provision that can be offered to young people. The majority of APs that I've spoken to across the country have said they've seen at least a 40% decline in referrals, which has actually directly translated into staff redundancies and the reduction in provision for students. The fundamental impact that this is having is seen on a daily basis by the fact that we've got students that are not currently in places where they should be. And the problem we've got is because we've got so many settings that are closing down due to the lack of referrals, when demand rises again, which we know it will be, the capacity is not going to be there. The issue we've got is that the funding for PRUs and APs is really, really complex. It's inconsistent, and for too many, it is really uncertain. The way in which APs are funded is on a per place basis. This allocation is then topped up from other sources, such as the high needs funding, and also some funding from local councils. But this varies across the country, so there is no arrangement that is the same anywhere in the country. The underlying issue is that, like pupil premium funding, the funding that we get into APs and PRUs is all down to how many people are in the situation, in the setting at the time. It fails to consider the APs, as we know, its fluctuating roles. So some moments in time will simply record more young people on roll in alternative provision than at any other point. In normal times, it's an issue, but with the disruptions of lockdown and COVID, it's potentially, and it has now reached catastrophic levels. So we've got head teachers starting the consultation process with unions about redundancies because it's something that they can fundamentally cut to save money. But the concern is what is going to happen to these schools over the coming weeks and months and years when actually we haven't got the provision, we haven't got the staff, and we haven't got the settings that can actually then take on the increase in capacity. We know that COVID has slowed the movement of pupils from mainstream to AP, but the idea that children's needs is reduced or that schools' ability to cater for them has somehow drastically improved is totally naive. In fact, as we're starting to come out of some of the lockdowns, the evidence that we've got is suggesting the opposite is actually true. So reducing the numbers of places and staff not only risks losing the expertise, but it's taking the support that those young people need away. And it's going to end up pushing them into unregulated and unregistered provision, which is something I'm going to touch on in a bit. We've now got a real risk that the infrastructure to prevent exclusions and to provide continuity of education is not going to be around. We've got to care for our vulnerable children, and we know that this has got to be a long-term plan. I know, having spoken to colleagues in London, that there's several alternative provision settings that have been forced to close sites due to the fact that they've got no funding to keep them open due to the lack of referrals. But the fact that there are going to be fewer students there doesn't mean that there's not going to be fewer students there in the future. We've also got in the north of the country and in the Midlands settings that are looking at completely restructuring due to the lack of the money that's been coming in. So for those of you who don't know how AP and PRU's funding works, I'm going to try and do a little whistle-stop tour now of how it's all about. So basically, councils commission alternative provision to take place, and it normally costs roughly, when on average, about £10,000 per student. What then takes place is that this is topped up by either the local council or through the the high funds budget. While some councils have paid this up front, other councils have decided to wait and to see how many people are actually going to be in the provision at any one time. This is despite guidance issued by the government in April of last year, stating that authorities should fund places on the basis of patterns that have taken place in the past. But the majority of local education authorities, the local authorities in this country, have basically ignored the guidance that has come out. So what alternative provision providers have asked for is that, that the top-up funding should come attached to the commission places, not the pupil numbers. So rather than saying each pupil place is roughly £10,000, rather than top it up and try and seek other funding from elsewhere, just put it all onto that initial place so that the £10,000 increases, so the base rate goes up, so that there's never this issue again where we actually don't have the funding that is required. The DfE have said that the high needs funding formula was going to be reviewed. This was supposed to take place 2 years ago. We keep asking for it. Again, it has been delayed. It was supposed to come out this year and it still hasn't been published. They're now suggesting that it's going to be published and reviewed in January. We will see. So we have now been told that the government have provided an additional 2.6 billion capital investment over the next 3 years for places for students with SEND. And some of this cash is going to be earmarked for funding some further alternative provision schools. The issue I ask is, if we are closing provision at the moment because we do not have the funding for them to remain open, how is this good use of the funding money? Why are we building new alternative provision units and free schools if we've got perfectly accessible and sensible places for it to take part in at the moment? But the reason we're having to close them is because the funding is not there. For me, this is just madness, and this is something that we need to be focusing on as a matter of urgency. What we've also started to notice here in Oxfordshire is that the alternative provision has been put up for tender. So what that basically boils down to is the fact that the council haven't got enough money to be able to pay and to support the current alternative provision offer. What they've tried to do to overcome the issues around funding here is that they've decided to, rather than stick with the current situation that works well, they've decided to put all the alternative provision up for offer. So anybody can bid to take over elements of the current provision. In a nutshell, that means they want to try and cut some providers. They want to make the provision cheaper because they want to save money. But the big issue that we've got, and this isn't just happening in Oxfordshire, this is happening elsewhere in the country, it's going to have disastrous consequences for our young people, as the provision that they were used to be having is no longer going to be there, and the provision that they're potentially going to be offered instead is not necessarily going to be up to the standards that we expect. Clearly, we need to be challenging this. As the District Secretary for Oxfordshire, I've been in touch with the local authority about this to make sure that any decisions that are made are regularly shared, not only with the unions, but also shared with those people that are currently the providers for alternative provision. And we've managed to enable it so that all providers are involved in the consultation process, but we've also managed to bring in local heads and parents and carers to ensure that they have a say in the tender process, because fundamentally it's their child that is going to be the person that is going to be moved. We've also contacted our local MPs and councillors to explain that, you know, fundamentally this reduction is going to have major issues and it's going to end up with young people in crisis. Locally, this fight's not over by a long shot, but it's something that everybody who works in alternative provision, has a child in alternative provision, also needs to be aware of across the country, because what's happening here in Oxfordshire is going to be happening elsewhere as well. A further issue is the fact that what's coming out of these tenders is the increase of unregistered providers. And the issue we've got with unregistered providers is the fact that we have absolutely no control over what goes on. So what does that really boil down to? So the number of children that we've currently got is unknown. It is currently estimated that there's between 2,600 and 10,000 students in unregistered alternative provision. But nobody really knows that. And I'll come on to why nobody really knows that in a moment. But the issue we've got is that very little is being done to try and find out how many students are in there and why these students are there. The issue that we've now got is we know that there's a massive debate raging about the role of exclusions in the contribution to the rise in knife crimes. But there is far less attention being given to what actually happens to the children that are excluded than the actual information that is being looked at into terms of the link between the two. We know that excluded children are at higher risk of being drawn into criminal activity, but we are not allowing them to be educated in the right conditions. At the moment, these students, and too many of these students, are being educated in substandard institutions where we simply have no idea what is being done to support their needs, but more importantly, to support them and to keep them out of crime. I'm sure there's probably some great unregistered providers out there doing fantastic work, but these providers should not have anything to fear about registering themselves. But due to the lack of funding, what we're starting to notice here in Oxfordshire and at other places is councils are turning to these unregistered providers, not only because they are cheap, but due to the fact that the current tender process has reduced the amount of places that is currently available. So therefore, this is an easy option for them to be able to send them to a different position. The situation becomes even murkier when students who have been excluded are referred to an oversubscribed PRU. The issue we've then got is that many of these subcontracted places are going to unregistered settings. An unregistered setting that you don't have to register to be a setting if you are offering part-time education. And this is where it gets very, very muddy, because an awful lot of these unregistered part-time places are actually offering full-time places, which therefore turns them into illegal education settings. So we've now got a situation where we've got students who have been excluded from school being referred to pupil referral units and alternative provision units that are oversubscribed. So they are then being subcontracted to these unregistered settings. What it started to result in is that there's children as young as 5 have been sent to school places in unsuitable accommodation with unqualified staff and are receiving very little in any formal education. We've managed to talk to Ofsted, or I've managed to talk to Ofsted about this, and Ofsted have found that there are some vulnerable children that have been educated in these settings where they definitely shouldn't be there, but at the moment there's no way of regulating it by the fact that the provision is down as being part-time. So if you are registered as if you're not registered and you are offering alternative provision on a part-time basis, you do not have Ofsted coming in. There is no sort of way of us being able to safeguard the children, and we have absolutely no way of knowing what actually takes part in there. Some inspectors that I spoke to probably about 3 months ago have actually managed to gain access to some of these unregulated places by the fact that parents are putting formal complaints. And then what they're also starting to see is that there's actually a growth in online alternative provision, which, okay, in some circumstances, online alternative provision might be useful. But if we've got a child that is having a problem, what can we do? We've been asking them to sit in front of a computer and go online to study. That is not an acceptable form of alternative provision. Ofsted have also said that they've started to see that unregistered providers are charging £27,000 a year per pupil. Now, as I said earlier, The average is about £10,000. So we've now hit an even bigger funding crisis by the fact that the money's not there to service the alternative provision that's already in place, but these unregistered providers have now crept in and have kind of given councils no alternative other than to pay the ridiculous amounts of money. And an awful lot of these providers are not staffed with people that are qualified, have not got the high levels of expertise that we know we need in these provisions, and we're ending up really damaging the future of these children's lives. We also know that there was a big issue with a school in Lincolnshire recently, which was charging £1,200 a week for students to go to, and lots of councils across the country were referring students to go there. I know that Essex Council has now admitted, and it's one of the only councils that has done so, that they've admitted sending people there where they actually hadn't gone in to look at what the setting was offering, what the safety measures were in place, and these were students that were classed as being extremely vulnerable. So I'm pretty sure you'll all agree we're in a major crisis within this setting. So what can we do to change this? The big thing is, like you guys turning up tonight, we've got to continue to talk about this crisis and not to be afraid to challenge these situations. Alternative provision is not talked about enough, and alternative provision does not get an agenda item nearly as much as it should do for our students. Ofsted have said they wish for the public to report unregistered providers to them, because that is the only way that they're going to be able to find out that these places exist. We also must be raising all these issues with our local MPs and councillors, like I've done in Oxfordshire, but most importantly, we need to be communicating this as much as possible with our NEU members locally, but also within our own workplaces. The things that we need to be doing is we need to get organised. This isn't going away. This situation is in crisis. And if we don't do something soon, we're going to end up with some students that have been completely lost and are completely damaged by the entire process, just trying to save money. So we want to continue this conversation, and there's several things that you can do. If you've not already done so, we do have a NEU unofficial SENS, PRUs and AP Facebook group. So it would be sensible for you to come along and join that. But there's also lots of other ways to continue to communicate. And we have got the introduction this year of an NEU SEND organising forum, which has been set up through HQ. And I have high hopes that we can argue for AP for a national campaign to raise not only the issues about the funding, but also the issues surrounding the redundancies of staff, the closures, the tenders, and more importantly, these unregistered providers, which need to be sorted sooner rather than later. So that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour as to what the crisis is that we've got at the moment in alternative provision. And I hope that will hopefully kind of give a bit of food for thought as to where we are in AP and PRUs at the moment. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lee. We need you giving that briefing to the DFE, I think, in front of the MPs. That was excellent. I really enjoyed that. That was fantastic, Lee. Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick bits. That if there's time, there will be a bit of Q&A. Okay, so please put questions in the Q&A section. There's also a survey for you to do that's been popped in the chat. If you are a Senko, we really want to get a better understanding of what's happening with Senkos at the minute. So please, if you're a Senko, fill that in. Our final speaker is the founder of Send Health in County Durham, where I am at the minute. So welcome, Emma Parker.
Thanks, Daniel. I wish I could be more positive, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to be right now. I can't think of a more desperate time for children, families and educators. Now more than ever, we need to join together, collectivise and campaign for a better future for all. Tonight, I'm going to speak to you as a parent, a SEND professional and a union officer. Since September, I have had hundreds of phone calls from parents and colleagues desperate for help, who are at their breaking point, unable to find support, unable to cope. Individually, we have battles every day. Battles we have no other option but to fight, not because we want to, but because we have no other alternative. Our children are struggling. External support has all but disappeared, and those who are lucky enough to be put on a waiting list have to wait months, if not years, for support. Our support staff leave or they're made redundant, and they don't get replaced. Who on the call tonight has bought sensory equipment, intervention programs, and items that you would support children out of your own pocket because your school can't afford it. Every child is unique and they learn in a multitude of ways, but our education system isn't set up for different. Our children don't fit in those tidy little boxes. They learn and communicate in different ways. The current assessment system is barbaric and it sends students up to fail, isolating them from their peers, penalising those who have difficulties with recall and speed. Education is not about a memory test. It should be about utilising knowledge and skills and using varying methods to allow our children opportunities to succeed and show us what they have learned. Across the UK, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of children in specialist settings who never should have been there. Children who didn't get early support, children who waited years for diagnosis, children who have reached crisis point and specialist provisions is now the only option, which means currently our specialist settings are now at capacity. Children and families are in crisis and schools are unable to support those that need it the most because they're full. In the last 3 weeks, I have received numerous phone calls from members, and I wanted to share a few of those with you. Phone call 1, an experienced and passionate SENCO reduced to tears, workload through the roof, unable to cope, wanting to know how she can leave the profession. Phone call 2, a school who has a child who has an EHCP. The child has been deemed to need an SEND setting, but there is none available. The child is unable to cope in the mainstream setting, is barely accessing work 5 years below her peers, and is lashing out. Staff and other pupils are being hurt. They have exhausted all avenues of support and are desperate. Phone call 3, an early careers primary teacher who came to the Send Help conference emailed asking if I could give her a call. She completed her final year of training during COVID, so has reduced classroom experience. She's passionate and she wants to support all of her children, but has no idea how to do it. Her course didn't really cover SEND and definitely didn't offer tips and strategies to help her in the classroom. She feels like she's failing all of her students. And when she asks for support in school, she's told it's quality first teaching. She has no idea what quality first teaching is. This is what we as educators face every day. But what I wanted to share with you tonight as well is a personal reflection from myself as a parent. I have 3 amazing boys who are autistic, 1 in a specialist provision, 2 in mainstream. Since September, I have had 5 SEND plan reviews, 1 EHCP review, 3 exclusion meetings, and spent over 100 hours on the phone to my children's schools. Our children are massively struggling post-lockdown. My youngest boy is in crisis. He's in year 8, and last year he was isolated in 1 room. This year he's expected to go into the full secondary, to move about, have numerous teachers, and his whole pastoral team have changed. The only way we are able to support him currently and to help his school to cope is to reduce his timetable. He is now down to an hour a day in school. I'm lucky because my employer is incredibly supportive. I can use flexi time and leave when I need to, so I can ensure I can support my child in his school. But for many families, this isn't the case. And I speak to parents weekly who have to give up their careers because they have their child with SEND. The picture is bleak, but there is hope. Our union has and will continue to challenge the government on funding, on inclusion, and ensuring that schools and educators have the tools they need to support us all. Collectively, we can make a difference. Last month, the Send Help conference welcomed 651 parents, carers, and educators and other professionals for a day of workshops, discussions, and support, something that is desperately needed and lacking for those who support children with SEND. Now, however, I'm going to get to the exciting bit. Last year at annual conference, I proposed an amendment to create a national SEND organising forum, a forum that would welcome anyone interested in SEND. Every educator is a SEND educator, and every provision has children with SEND within it. And I'm absolutely over the moon to see this vital group is now up and ready to go. We want and need you all involved. Email membership. Directions will be put in the chat. Tell them that you want to be identified as interested in SEND. Every region will have 3 representatives, and we want to cover all sectors and sections and job roles because we need a voice for every area of SEND. Consider standing, and if you can't, or someone else is elected, reach out to your SEND organising forum member, create regional WhatsApp groups, support each other, work with colleagues, families and children. We can make a difference, we can have a positive impact, and we can instigate the change so desperately needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you for all you do. And I was at the SEND Help Conference just the other week, and it was fantastic. You really are building a movement for change in regards to SEND, so do keep on fighting. We have a couple of questions, so if any of the panelists would like to answer these. I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. Should teachers be doing EHCP reviews, including all of the paperwork as part of their normal working week with no extra PPA? Could you clarify what the SEN allowance is actually for? So would anyone in our panel like to answer that question?
I'm happy to do the EHCP bit.
Yep.
EHCPs, it's tricky and it depends on what type of paperwork you're doing, but it absolutely, you can't be directed during PPA to do anything. That is your time to do what you deem to be needed, whether that is planning, whether that is marking, whether it all those things. If you are going to do an EHCP, then actually you need to take the time to discuss it with parents, to go through kind of all of the forms. They are onerous, they are important, and it is about ensuring that every child has the provision and their needs are identified. So I would be asking for additional time out of the classroom, make sure that that can be done correctly, because if it isn't, that we can't support those children to the best of our ability.
Thank you very much, Emma. Would anybody else like to answer part of the question? What's the SEN allowance for? Or add anything to the EHCP? Jenny or Lee? I mean, my understanding on the SEN allowance, been working with SEMH young people, is that sometimes you have to require, there's a bit of a requirement to do things outside of the normal role of the teacher. And so it's part of a grace and favour payment for that. Jenny?
Just to add, I suppose, if you're in a mainstream school and you're being asked to do that work, it should be with the support of the SENCO, and the SENCO should be kind of leading and advising on that. In a sense, if you're in a special school, I suppose you are all kind of SENCO, but your SEN allowance should reflect that. So, you know, everyone working in that setting should have one, but also anybody in a mainstream provision or alternative provision who is spending a lot of their role doing SEN type work should also have that allowance. By the way, there used to be, you know, two levels of the allowance. It's now a kind of sliding scale, I think, but generally everybody is set on the absolute minimum of the sliding scale that you can have for the SEN allowance. It's always worth trying to push for the higher amount. I'm one of the few people left, I think, in the country that is on the higher amount. I somehow did a little bit of bribery in my school and managed to keep it. It was a historic thing, but you can use it as an example and say that, you know, there's other people that have that higher amount because of the work they're doing.
Thanks, Jenny. All my colleagues in my SEMH school were on SEN2, so I think it is possible to win that in school and argue for it. So do that. Another question here from Mark Norwood. What are we, or should we be doing about the spike in permanent exclusion post-COVID? Mainstream schools not being funded properly to provide post-lockdown adaptations for some children who have had months of chaos and neglect in difficult home environments. We are seeing huge increases in Key Stage 3 permanent exclusions of children where schools are not making any allowances for them having lived through the pandemic. So what are we and what should we be doing on exclusions? Would anybody like to answer that? Lee?
Shall I come in on this bit? I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, doesn't it? I mean, we knew that although there was a major drop in referrals to alternative provision during COVID, we knew that there was going to be a major spike after it due to the fact of the conditions that Mark's just mentioned, of the fact that people have been in home environments that haven't been enjoyable, haven't been sort of educational environments, and not a situation that anybody would have wanted to be in. And there's several questions that I would suggest that gets asked here. We all know that the government promised money post-COVID to that schools could apply for to support I think that the recovery programme, I think, is the technical term that they referred to it as. So I know an awful lot of primary schools have applied for it, but I'm not necessarily sure how many secondary schools have actually applied for the money. So I think if it's a secondary school, which it sounds like it is by the fact that there's Key Stage 3 students there, I'd be challenging my head teacher to find out where, if we did apply for that money, where has it gone? What are we doing with that money? And what are the plans to be putting into place to support these students? You know, exclusion isn't the answer. You know, these are the students that ironically need to be in an inclusion unit. And the word inclusion, unfortunately, is wrongly used so many times, it drives me around the twist. Students need to be included in the education system that they are within, not excluded to be included in a different setting. So I think the argument needs to be, and the challenge will be, to go and speak to the head teacher and speak to the SEN department to find out, did that money get applied for, and how has that been spent? If it hasn't been spent to support these children that are clearly struggling, then there needs to be some sort of investigation to find out where that money has gone instead. And I think the issue with the Key Stage 3 exclusions is, certainly in Oxfordshire, the majority of the alternative provision is very much geared up for Key Stage 4. You know, the Key Stage 3 one was one of the first things to go during this, or what they were trying to do was to get rid of in this tender process was Key Stage 3, because they didn't see that there was as much of a need. I think what needs to be done, I don't know whereabouts in the country you are, Mark, but I think you need to have a conversation with your head teacher to find out where this funding money has gone and what it has been used on. I also would strongly suggest that you get in touch with your branch secretary within your union to find out what is going on county-wide in terms of what are the council doing about alternative provision, in terms of the fact that the funding money should start to come in after Christmas, and you know, for the next high needs budget, because it was all taken on the free school meals. So the money should be coming in. Where has that money gone? And I would strongly suggest that you write and get in touch with your own MP. My MP gets a letter from me on a daily basis, I think, poor sod. But, you know, I'm not giving in. It's a case of these children need our support. We know these issues are going on, but nobody's doing anything about it. You need to raise it and contact your local councillors to find out, because your district secretary will have meetings with the council. I have my meetings with them on sort of a half-termly basis, and it's an agenda item every time I go. What is happening with alternative provision? It sounds like your district secretary, your district and branch secretary need to have that on there to find out what is happening about this. I certainly think that the union needs to be doing an awful lot more about this and making it much more wider, so that everybody in secondary knows what the issues are with alternative provision. Because if secondary teachers are wanting to know, why aren't these kids going? Why aren't they disappearing? You know, the reason is that nobody should be disappearing from anywhere. The support should be within the school setting that they're in. But the situation around alternative provision at the moment is there is nowhere for them to go because the council have fundamentally cut the provision. So I think we need to be doing more to talk to people about this. But I think you need to start with talking to your head, contacting your district secretary, and making contact with the local council to find out what it is that they're doing about alternative provision.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm going to just quickly answer a question here from Hayley. It says, I'm new to alternative provision and no member of staff gets any breaks. Right, you need to organise a union group, get in contact with your district secretary, because all members of staff should be having a break. And in the alternative provision and SEMH schools that I've worked in, we've had a separate, those who've agreed to work lunches have agreed to work lunches and are paid separately on a lunchtime supervisor's salary, and also get a school dinner. Those are things that you need to negotiate around on that. And I hope that answers your question, but please do get in contact with your district secretary. We've got another question here from Yvonne. It says, we have so many staff off of COVID and staff who are not getting PPA, and lesson observations are still going ahead. What can I do? So over to you, Jenny.
So PPA has to be honoured. You know, it's there in the regulations that PPA is protected and you have to have it. So it's for, you know, the management of the school to solve the issue of there's people off and they can't staff. If necessary, the senior leaders go in and cover your PPA themselves, because it's there and it has to be protected regardless of whatever else is going on.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Okay, and another one here. I'm in an alternative provision, and this is in regards to the breaks. So the break seems to be a bit of a key issue at the moment. Does anybody have anything from the panel to add to breaks?
It's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it, depending on what contract you're on. So if you're on a teaching contract, then it is quite explicit that you have to take your breaks between your lunch break between a certain time period, which I can't remember off the top of my head, which I'm sure Jenny probably will do in a moment. Jenny?
12 and 2, is it? Or 11?
I was going to guess at 12 and 2, but I thought rather than guess, I'd go for it. That you have to have your break within a designated time period. Now, break times can be directed times for teachers. So again, that would go back to needing to sit down and do a 1265 directed time calculations to make sure that if you are directed to do something in your break time, that it doesn't push your hours over the year OTT. The issue for breaks and lunches for support staff who are on the Green Book becomes very muddy, in the sense of teachers have that specific time period between 12 and 2. People on the Green Book can be a bit more muddy by the fact that you have to have worked for so many hours before you are entitled to a break. But what you need to be really mindful of is the majority of schools would have written what your break entitlements are into your contracts. So it's a case of going back to look at your individual contracts to find out what hours you are timetabled to work, but whether there is a specific mention of when you are entitled to take your breaks and as to whether that's directed or not. So again, it's a bit muddy, but again, if you go to the NEU website, there's some really good advice for Green Book staff on there about all your entitlements with regard to working hours, sick pay, sick leave, etc., and it really clearly outlines it. If it's not been done in a fashion that you're supposed to be done and it's not in line with what's written into your contract, that again is when you need to get in touch with either the NEU advice line or get in touch with your local district secretary.
Absolutely, and you know, working in SEMH settings for a long period of time, I'm seeing here from 8:15 until 2:30 until you can have a break, sounds like an issue in regard to health and safety. I mean, I've really worked in those settings, and they can be very joyous places, but also very intense from time to time. So do get in contact with your district in regards to that. As a bare minimum, you are entitled to, I think it's 20 minutes in a 6-hour period. So that's that's government legislation. Obviously, our terms and conditions for support staff and teachers are beyond that. Okay, so question.
Can I just add something quickly to that? That a lot of people I know in special schools and alternative provisions have seen their conditions get worse since the pandemic, because a lot of people offered to give up lunch breaks and things and add staggered times as a goodwill gesture. And it's now being expected that carries on. But there shouldn't be any change to your conditions without your consultation and the consultation of union reps in the building. So if you used to have half an hour, say, for lunch, regardless of what the reasons are or what's written down, if you used to have half an hour and it's now gone down to 20 minutes, then you've got, that shouldn't be happening without consultation.
And absolutely right there, Jenny. And on the 12 until 2, if you're a teacher, that is when, as Lee said, that's when your lunch should be. And if there's an expectation to work through that, you should be paid, and it should be negotiated as a union group, and also a school dinner. In some settings, there is hope to do that. Okay, so I think we have answered Hayley's question, which is good. But most importantly, get in contact with district secretaries who can advise you, who have better understandings of your school, better understandings of your settings. But really, what's really important is if you've not got a rep in your setting, to organise your members, get elected, and negotiate with your employer with the support of your district. Okay, I think we have come to the end of the questions. Does anybody have anything to add before we close? Any of our panelists? Over to you, Jenny and Emma. Jenny, Emma and Lee.
I've just popped something in the chat. It was on around exclusions, and I think this is something that needs to be highlighted to all staff and all parents. The SEND code of practice is your best friend. And you need to utilize it. You need to know it inside out. You need to know about reasonable adjustments. And one of the things I have used as both a professional and a parent is I've used children's diagnostics. So the diagnostics around their disability, and I've argued disability discrimination. One of the big things that we seem to be coming up against at the moment is autistic children verbally talking in classrooms and being penalized for that. And unfortunately, for a lot of our autistic children, they verbally process and they shouldn't be penalized for that. There's ways and means around it. So absolutely, you know, look at that. And the thing around exclusions as well is we see a lot of schools that are very much, I use the term groundhogs, because what they do is they do the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different outcome. You know, if you're excluding a child for the same thing every other week, that doesn't work. You need to really go back to basics and unpick what is going on, because you can't do that without understanding the child's perspective.
Thank you, Emma. And just before we close, we've got one last question here from Emily. One of maybe our panel could answer. Could you clarify the rules, recommendations around LSAs and TAs covering planned teacher absences? We have LSAs covering for teachers, but planned absence. This is training for the whole day, delivering lessons with no teacher cover at all. Would anybody like to answer that?
I'll do that one as well. I think it's incredibly difficult, and I you know, to answer this, because it is based on your contract. You need to look at it in County Durham, where I am. Some of our TAs, it's written into contract that they actually can cover teacher absence on a short period. Some can't. So I think you need to be looking at that. But if it is long term, I absolutely think it needs to be looked at, and it also and safety around the classroom. But if you've got any queries, I would, as Daniel has said, get in touch with your local branch and district secretary, and they can help guide you through the contract that you've got and the policies within the school.
Also, Emily, it's acceptable for a short period to be able to cover depending on your contract, but you shouldn't be planning or resourcing that. If you're doing that, you should be getting paid a teacher's salary. So please make sure that your employer is aware of that. But as always, organise in the workplace. Jenny.
Yeah, just on that and on everything else, I think we need to remember that we're a union and we exist to protect our conditions of work, and that if you don't look after the staff at work, then the children won't be sufficiently looked after either. So we mustn't allow employers to use against us the argument about the poor vulnerable children suffering if we don't agree to X, Y, and Z, because X, Y, and Z are often not doable, not acceptable, and not in the best interests of the children either. So as union members, you know, we need to kind of get together and resist some of the silly things that we're asked to do. Yeah, and that's it really.
Thank you very much. So thank you to everybody who was tuned in this evening. Thank you for the fantastic questions. Hope that you've been able to get some of those asked, but please get involved in your district if you're not involved in your district. And if your school's not got a rep, please become a rep, organise your workplace and challenge some of these issues as a collective. Your voice is always stronger when there's a group of you who are organising around collective demands. A huge thank you to Jenny, Emma and Lee. And let's keep on raising the demand for just resources for SEND young people and an education system that can help them flourish. So solidarity all. And if you've got a spare hour next, it's UK Disability History Month. So tune on over in that. Take care, everybody.